Sarah Martinez had always been the reliable one in her group. When their remote research station in the Amazon rainforest began running low on medical supplies and communication equipment, everyone knew she would volunteer for the dangerous journey to the nearest supply depot. The station housed 12 researchers studying rare plant species, and they were completely cut off from civilization except for their weekly radio check-ins. The supply depot sat 40 miles away through dense jungle terrain. Sarah had made this trip twice before, always with her partner Jake. But this time he was recovering from a severe case of malaria. The team couldn't wait another week for him to recover. Their antibiotics were nearly gone, and without fresh batteries for their radio equipment, they would lose all contact with the outside world. Dr. Williams, the team leader, pulled Sarah aside before her departure. His weathered face showed deep concern as he handed her the encrypted GPS device. The route to the depot was marked clearly, but he warned her about increased rebel activity in the region. Local indigenous tribes had reported strange movements in the forest, and several supply convoys had gone missing in recent weeks. Sarah packed light but smart. Her backpack contained water purification tablets, emergency flares, a machete, and enough food for 3 days. She also carried a satellite phone for emergencies, though the thick canopy often blocked the signal. The most important item was the supply list and authorization codes needed to access the depot's automated systems. The morning mist hung heavy as Sarah set out on the narrow trail. The jungle was alive with sounds of howler monkeys and exotic birds. She moved at a steady pace, knowing she needed to reach the first checkpoint by noon. The trail wound through dense vegetation, crossing several small streams and climbing over fallen trees that blocked the path. By midday, Sarah reached the abandoned logging camp that served as her first rest stop. The rusty equipment and overgrown buildings created an eerie atmosphere. She checked her GPS coordinates and confirmed she was making good time. After a quick meal of energy bars and water, she continued deeper into the jungle. The afternoon brought unexpected challenges. Heavy rains had washed out part of the trail, forcing Sarah to make a dangerous detour through swampy terrain. Her boots sank into the muddy ground with each step, and she had to use her machete to cut through thick vines that blocked her path. The GPS signal flickered in and out, making navigation increasingly difficult. As evening approached, Sarah decided to make camp in a small clearing beside a stream. She set up her lightweight tent and prepared a simple dinner. The jungle sounds seemed different at night, more threatening somehow. She heard strange noises in the distance that didn't match any wildlife she knew. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and something felt wrong about this place. Sarah checked her satellite phone but couldn't get a signal through the dense canopy. She made detailed notes in her journal about the route and her observations. The supply depot was still 20 miles away, and she planned to reach it by the following evening. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. During the night, Sarah was awakened by the sound of branches snapping nearby. She lay perfectly still in her tent, listening carefully to the sounds outside. Whatever was moving through the jungle was trying to be quiet, but it was definitely human. She gripped her machete tightly and prepared for the worst, but the sounds eventually faded into the distance. The next morning brought fresh concerns. Sarah discovered footprints around her campsite that definitely weren't hers. Someone had been watching her while she slept. The prints were recent and belonged to at least 3 different people wearing military-style boots. Her heart raced as she realized she might be walking into a trap. Sarah quickly packed her gear and studied her GPS device. She could continue on the main trail to the depot, but that might be exactly what her pursuers expected. There was an alternate route marked on her map, longer and more dangerous, but it might help her avoid whoever was tracking her. She made the difficult decision to abandon the familiar path and strike out through uncharted territory. The new route took her through some of the most challenging terrain she had ever encountered. Steep ravines, thick undergrowth, and treacherous river crossings slowed her progress considerably. She was no longer certain she could reach the depot before nightfall, but staying alive was more important than staying on schedule. Behind her, she occasionally heard sounds that suggested her pursuers were still following, though they seemed to be having trouble tracking her new route. The alternate route proved more treacherous than Sarah had imagined. By afternoon, she found herself scrambling up steep rocky slopes covered in slippery moss. Her hands were scraped and bleeding from grabbing onto sharp rocks and thorny vines. The GPS signal had completely disappeared under the thick canopy, leaving her to navigate by compass and instinct alone. Sarah paused at the top of a ridge to catch her breath and survey the terrain ahead. Through her binoculars, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. In a clearing about half a mile away, she could see military tents and armed guards. This wasn't just a random group of rebels or bandits. Someone had established a well-organized camp directly between her and the supply depot. She studied the camp more carefully, counting at least 8 armed men wearing mismatched military gear. They had vehicles, communication equipment, and what looked like heavy weapons. Most disturbing of all, she recognized the location from her map. They were camped at the junction where all trails to the supply depot converged. Anyone trying to reach the depot would have to pass through their checkpoint. Sarah realized this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had leaked information about the research team's supply runs. The rebels knew exactly when and where to intercept anyone heading to the depot. Her teammates back at the station were probably walking into the same trap whenever they made their next supply run. She had to find a way to warn them and still complete her mission. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Sarah worked her way around the rebel camp. She discovered they had set up additional observation posts on nearby hills, creating a network of surveillance that covered all the main approaches to the depot. The rebels were obviously planning something bigger than just robbing supply convoys. Their equipment and organization suggested they were preparing for a major operation. As she watched through her binoculars, Sarah saw something that made her stomach turn. The rebels were unloading wooden crates from a truck, and the markings on the boxes were clearly visible. These were military explosives, the kind used for demolition work. They weren't just planning to rob the supply depot. They intended to destroy it, cutting off all supplies to the research stations and indigenous communities in the region. Sarah knew she had to get closer to gather more intelligence. Using skills learned during her military training before joining the research team, she began a careful approach through the dense undergrowth. The rebels seemed confident in their security, posting guards only on the main trails. They hadn't expected anyone to approach through the nearly impassable terrain she had just crossed. From her new position, Sarah could hear conversations between the guards. They were speaking in Spanish mixed with local dialect, but she understood enough to grasp their basic plan. The attack on the depot was scheduled for the following morning. They would plant explosives around the facility, then ambush any rescue teams that responded to the destruction. The research stations would be completely isolated, making them easy targets for whatever the rebels planned next. Sarah managed to get close enough to photograph some of the weapons and equipment using her camera's telephoto lens. The images would provide valuable intelligence if she could get them to the authorities, but first she had to survive long enough to transmit them. Her satellite phone still couldn't get a signal, and she was too far from the research station to reach them by radio. The situation became even more complicated when Sarah overheard the rebel leader giving orders for a patrol to sweep the area where she had been camping the night before. They had definitely detected her presence and were actively hunting for her. Worse still, they mentioned capturing her alive for interrogation. They suspected she might be carrying valuable information about the research stations and their personnel. Sarah realized she was trapped between the rebel camp and their patrol units. The supply depot was still 10 miles away through territory, now crawling with hostile forces. Even if she could reach it safely, the facility might already be compromised. She needed a new plan that would allow her to complete her mission while avoiding capture and warning her team about the impending danger. As darkness fell, Sarah made a desperate decision. She would attempt to reach the supply depot under cover of night, moving through terrain too difficult for the rebel patrols to follow. It would be incredibly dangerous in the dark, but it might be her only chance to stay ahead of her pursuers. She carefully marked her position on the map and began preparing for the most challenging night of her life. The rebel camp below was now fully illuminated by generator-powered lights. Guards walked regular patrols around the perimeter, and she could see sentries posted at key observation points. Radio chatter indicated they were coordinating with other units in the area. Sarah was facing a much larger and more organized force than she had initially realized. Whatever was happening here was part of a bigger operation that threatened not just her research team, but potentially all the scientific and humanitarian work being done in this region of the Amazon. Moving through the Amazon jungle at night was like navigating through a living nightmare. Every shadow could hide danger, and every sound might signal approaching enemies. Sarah had wrapped her flashlight with red cellophane to preserve her night vision while providing just enough light to avoid stepping on venomous snakes or falling into hidden ravines that dotted the landscape. The rebel patrols were more active than she had expected. Every few hundred yards she had to freeze and listen for the sounds of boots on jungle trails or the crackle of radio communications. The rebels were using night vision equipment and coordinating their search patterns with military precision. Sarah began to suspect that whoever was leading this operation had serious combat experience and resources, far beyond typical jungle rebels. After 2 hours of careful movement, Sarah reached a steep gorge that blocked her path to the supply depot. The narrow river at the bottom rushed loudly over rocks, masking sounds but also making it impossible for her to hear approaching threats. A fallen tree provided the only way across, but it was slippery with moss and positioned directly under an open section of sky where she would be visible to anyone with night vision equipment. Sarah studied the crossing for several minutes before making her move. Halfway across the fallen log, she heard voices approaching from upstream. 3 rebels were moving along the riverbank with flashlights, searching for signs of her passage. She pressed herself flat against the wet bark and held her breath as they passed directly beneath her position. One of them stopped and aimed his light upward, scanning the fallen tree, but the thick moss and her dark clothing kept her hidden. Once the patrol moved on, Sarah completed her crossing and continued toward the depot. The GPS device finally began picking up signals again, showing she was within 5 miles of her destination. However, the terrain ahead looked even more challenging than what she had already crossed. The map indicated a series of steep hills and dense swampland that would slow her progress considerably. The swamp proved to be a nightmare of sucking mud, tangled roots, and stagnant water that reached up to her waist in some places. Strange sounds echoed through the humid air, from the splash of caimans moving through the water to the rustle of unknown creatures in the overhead branches. Sarah's waterproof boots kept most of the swamp water out, but her legs were soon covered in leeches that she had to remove carefully to avoid infection. As dawn approached, Sarah finally caught sight of the supply depot through the trees. The facility was larger than she had expected, with several concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Solar panels on the roofs powered the automated systems, and she could see camera towers at each corner of the compound. Everything looked normal from a distance, but Sarah's instincts told her something was wrong. She approached the depot carefully, using her binoculars to study the facility for signs of rebel presence. The main gate appeared secure, and the automated systems seemed to be functioning normally. However, fresh tire tracks in the mud around the perimeter suggested vehicles had been here recently. The tracks were too new to be from the last scheduled supply delivery, which had happened over a week ago. Sarah decided to circle the entire facility before attempting to enter. During her reconnaissance, she discovered something alarming hidden in the jungle behind the main building. Several small packages had been attached to the fence and buildings, connected by thin wires that were nearly invisible in the early morning light. The rebels had already planted their explosives just as she had overheard in their camp. The situation was now critical. The explosives could be detonated at any moment, possibly by remote control or timer. Sarah needed to get inside the facility, gather the supplies her team desperately needed, and find a way to disable the explosives before they destroyed everything. She also had to assume that the rebels were monitoring the facility and would know the moment she entered the compound. Sarah found an unguarded section of fence where the razor wire had been cut, probably by the rebels when they planted their explosives. She squeezed through the gap and made her way to the main building. Her authorization codes worked perfectly, and the automated door opened with a soft mechanical hum. Inside, she found rows of shelves stocked with medical supplies, communication equipment, food, and other essentials needed by the research teams. Working quickly, Sarah gathered the most critical items on her list: antibiotics, radio batteries, water purification tablets, and emergency medical equipment filled her backpack to capacity. She also located a military-grade satellite phone that could transmit through the jungle canopy, potentially allowing her to contact the outside world and call for help. While loading supplies, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching the depot. Through the window, she watched as 2 military trucks pulled up to the main gate. Armed rebels began deploying around the facility, setting up what looked like a complex ambush. They had obviously been waiting for someone to trigger the depot's security systems by entering the facility. Sarah realized she was trapped inside the building with enemies surrounding the compound. The explosives planted around the facility meant that even if she could fight her way out, the rebels could destroy everything with the push of a button. She needed a plan that would neutralize the threat, secure her escape route, and prevent the destruction of this vital supply depot that served the entire research community in the region. The satellite phone in her hands represented her best hope of turning the situation around. If she could contact the military base in the capital city and provide the intelligence she had gathered about the rebel operation, help might arrive in time to save not just herself, but also protect her team and the other researchers who depended on this facility for their survival in the remote Amazon wilderness. Sarah crouched behind a stack of supply crates as voices grew louder outside the depot building. Through the reinforced windows, she could see rebels taking positions around the compound. They moved with the discipline of trained soldiers, establishing fields of fire and communication points that would make any escape attempt extremely dangerous. The leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his cheek, was directing operations with hand signals. The military-grade satellite phone finally found a signal, but Sarah knew she had only minutes before the rebels would storm the building. She quickly dialed the emergency number for the regional military command center in Bogotá. After several tense seconds, a voice answered in Spanish. Sarah identified herself as a researcher under attack and began rapidly transmitting the coordinates of the rebel camp, the supply depot, and details about the planned destruction of the facility. Before she could finish her report, the building's lights went out. The rebels had cut the power, probably as a prelude to their final assault. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows throughout the supply warehouse. Sarah could hear boots approaching the main entrance and knew her time was running out. She grabbed the emergency flare gun from the survival equipment and prepared to defend herself. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. Rebels breached the main entrance while others cut through the fence and approached from the rear. Sarah fired the flare gun through the front window, temporarily blinding the attackers and creating a smokescreen that filled the room with thick, choking smoke. The distraction bought her precious seconds to reach a more defensible position behind the concrete loading dock. Gunfire erupted as rebels stormed into the building. Sarah used her knowledge of the facility's layout to move between the supply shelves, staying ahead of the search teams. She had military training from her time in the reserves, but she was severely outgunned and outnumbered. Her only advantages were her familiarity with the building and the rebels' apparent orders to capture her alive rather than simply shoot her on sight. The satellite phone crackled with an incoming transmission. The military command center was trying to get more details about her situation, but Sarah couldn't risk giving away her position by speaking. Instead, she sent text messages with critical information about the explosives, the size of the rebel force, and the urgent need for immediate rescue. The response was encouraging. A helicopter gunship was being dispatched from the nearest military base. Sarah's relief was short-lived when she overheard the rebel leader shouting orders in Spanish. They had intercepted her satellite transmission and knew that help was coming. The leader was telling his men to plant additional explosives and prepare for an immediate withdrawal. They planned to blow up the entire facility with Sarah inside, then disappear into the jungle before the military arrived. Moving carefully through the darkened warehouse, Sarah began searching for the detonator controls. The rebels wouldn't want to be too close to the building when they triggered the explosives, so they probably had a remote detonation device. If she could find and disable it, she might prevent the destruction of the facility and buy time for the rescue team to arrive. A burst of automatic gunfire shattered the windows near her hiding spot. The rebels were getting frustrated with their search and had apparently decided to flush her out with concentrated firepower. Sarah could hear them coordinating a systematic sweep of the building, room by room. She realized that her position behind the loading dock would soon be discovered. Using the emergency lighting to her advantage, Sarah created multiple shadows by positioning herself between different light sources. This confusion tactic had worked in her military training exercises, making it difficult for enemies to determine her exact location. She then used a maintenance ladder to climb into the building's ceiling space, where she could move above the rebels without being detected. From her position in the ceiling, Sarah could see the entire warehouse floor below. The rebels had indeed brought a remote detonator, and their leader was carrying it in a backpack along with what appeared to be additional explosive charges. If she could somehow get close enough to disable the device, she might be able to turn the tables on her attackers. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, but Sarah knew the rebels would detonate the explosives long before the rescue team could reach her. She made a desperate decision to drop down from the ceiling directly onto the rebel leader, hoping to surprise him and grab the detonator before he could trigger the explosives. Sarah's attack caught the rebels completely off guard. She landed squarely on the leader's back, sending him crashing into a shelf of medical supplies. The detonator flew from his hands and skittered across the concrete floor. Other rebels immediately opened fire, but their shots went wild as Sarah and their leader struggled on the ground among scattered boxes and equipment. Wrestling with the scarred leader, Sarah quickly realized he was much stronger than she had expected. His combat experience was evident in his fighting techniques, and he managed to throw her off and reach for his sidearm. Sarah rolled behind a concrete pillar, just as bullets began chipping away at the concrete around her position. The detonator was still lying in the open, tantalizingly close but impossible to reach under heavy gunfire. The helicopter sounds were getting closer, and Sarah could hear the rebels shouting about the approaching aircraft. Their leader was screaming orders to plant the remaining explosives and prepare for immediate evacuation. Sarah realized this was her last chance to prevent the destruction of the facility, and possibly save not just her own life, but protect the vital supply line that her research team and others depended on for survival in the remote Amazon wilderness. The thunderous roar of military helicopters filled the air as Sarah made her desperate move for the detonator. She sprinted from behind the concrete pillar, diving and sliding across the smooth warehouse floor as bullets whined overhead. Her fingers closed around the remote device just as the rebel leader's boot came down, barely missing her hand. She rolled away clutching the detonator, but now she was trapped in the open with nowhere to hide. The rebel leader drew his knife and advanced on Sarah with murder in his eyes. His scarred face twisted with rage as he realized she had disrupted months of careful planning. Behind him, his men were already preparing to retreat as the sound of helicopters grew deafening. Sarah backed against a wall of supply crates, holding the detonator high above her head, threatening to smash it if he came any closer. Outside, the military helicopters had arrived and were circling the facility. Loudspeakers crackled with demands for the rebels to surrender, but gunfire erupted as the terrorists opened fire on the aircraft. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of a helicopter's machine gun returning fire, sending the rebels scrambling for cover. The building shook as heavy bullets struck the walls and roof. The distraction gave Sarah the opening she needed. She smashed the detonator against the concrete wall, shattering the device into dozens of pieces. The rebel leader lunged forward with his knife, but Sarah had anticipated the move. Using a combat technique from her military training, she grabbed his wrist and used his momentum to throw him over her shoulder into a stack of metal shelving. Explosions rocked the building as the military helicopters launched missiles at the rebel vehicles outside. The entire structure shuddered and pieces of ceiling began falling as the battle intensified. Sarah realized that even with the main detonator destroyed, the rebels might have backup devices or could still trigger individual explosive charges manually. She needed to get out of the building before it became a tomb. Fighting her way through smoke and debris, Sarah reached the emergency exit at the rear of the building. She could see rebels retreating into the jungle under heavy fire from the circling helicopters. Some were carrying what looked like backup detonators and additional explosives. The threat wasn't over yet, and she needed to reach the military forces to provide intelligence about the remaining dangers. A massive explosion behind her sent Sarah tumbling to the ground as one section of the warehouse erupted in flames. The rebels had managed to detonate at least some of their charges, and the fire was spreading rapidly through the building. Sarah's backpack full of medical supplies was still inside, but there was no way to retrieve it now without being killed by the flames or collapsing structure. Sarah ran toward the landing zone where she could see a military helicopter touching down. Soldiers were already deploying and engaging the fleeing rebels with precision rifle fire. She waved frantically to identify herself as the person who had called for help, but in the chaos of the battle, she wasn't sure if anyone had seen her. Stray bullets were still flying as rebels made their final desperate stands before disappearing into the dense jungle. A young lieutenant spotted Sarah and directed to soldiers to escort her to safety behind an armored vehicle. She quickly briefed them on the location of the rebel camp, the number of remaining terrorists, and the possibility of additional explosive devices. The information proved crucial as the military team began coordinating a pursuit into the jungle to prevent the rebels from regrouping and attacking other targets. The lieutenant handed Sarah a radio and asked her to guide a second helicopter to the main rebel camp she had discovered earlier. Using her GPS coordinates and detailed observations, she was able to direct the aircraft to the exact location where the rebels had been planning their larger operation. The helicopter crew reported finding abandoned equipment and evidence of a much bigger terrorist network than anyone had suspected. As the immediate battle died down, Sarah finally had a moment to assess her situation. She was injured, exhausted, and had lost most of the critical supplies her research team desperately needed. However, she had prevented a major terrorist attack that could have crippled humanitarian and scientific work throughout the entire Amazon region. The depot could be rebuilt, but the lives that would have been lost couldn't be replaced. The military commander arrived by helicopter to personally debrief Sarah about what she had witnessed. Her detailed intelligence about the rebel organization, their equipment, and their plans would be invaluable in tracking down the remaining members of the terrorist network. She learned that similar attacks had been planned against research stations, indigenous communities, and government facilities throughout the rainforest. Medical personnel treated Sarah's injuries while she continued providing information about the rebel activities. Her photographs of their weapons and equipment helped military intelligence identify the source of their funding and support. It appeared that the rebels were part of a larger criminal organization involved in drug trafficking, illegal mining, and environmental destruction throughout the Amazon basin. As evening fell, Sarah was evacuated by helicopter to a military hospital in the capital city. During the flight, she looked down at the endless green canopy of the Amazon rainforest and thought about her teammates back at the research station. They would be worried sick about her failure to return on schedule, but she knew that her mission had ultimately been successful, in ways she never could have imagined when she first set out to gather simple medical supplies. The helicopter pilot informed her that emergency supplies were already being airlifted to her research station and several others in the region. The military had also established temporary security patrols to protect the scientific teams, while they continued their important work studying and preserving the Amazon ecosystem. Sarah's dangerous journey had accomplished far more than just a routine supply run. 3 days later, Sarah finally returned to the research station, arriving by military helicopter with fresh supplies and a team of security specialists. Her colleagues rushed out to greet her as the aircraft touched down in the small clearing that served as their landing zone. Dr. Williams was the first to reach her, his relief evident as he helped her down from the helicopter with her arm still in a sling from her injuries. The reunion was emotional as Sarah's teammates gathered around to hear her story. Jake, still recovering from malaria but much improved, couldn't believe what she had endured during what was supposed to be a routine supply mission. The other researchers listened in amazement as she described the rebel camp, the siege at the depot, and the military rescue that had prevented a much larger catastrophe. Sarah learned that her research team hadn't been the only ones in danger. Military intelligence had used her information to uncover a network of terrorist cells planning coordinated attacks throughout the Amazon region. The rebels had been working with drug cartels and illegal mining operations to drive out legitimate researchers and government personnel, clearing the way for massive environmental destruction and criminal activities. The security team that accompanied Sarah would remain at the station for several weeks while the military continued operations against the remaining rebels. This protection would allow the research team to continue their critical work studying endangered plant species without fear of attack. Sarah's actions had not only saved lives but had also preserved important scientific research that could lead to new medical discoveries. Dr. Williams presented Sarah with the complete analysis of their recent plant samples, showing that they had indeed discovered several species with potential pharmaceutical applications. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that her mission to gather medical supplies had ultimately protected research that might lead to new medicines for treating diseases like the malaria that had afflicted Jake and countless others in the region. Over the following days, Sarah worked with military investigators to identify other potential targets and help plan operations against the remaining rebel cells. Her detailed observations and photographs provided crucial intelligence that led to the arrest of several key figures in the criminal network. The terrorist leader with the distinctive scar was captured trying to cross the border into a neighboring country. The supply depot was completely destroyed in the battle, but construction teams were already working to build a larger and more secure facility. The new depot would include better defensive measures and improved communication systems to prevent similar attacks in the future. Sarah's satellite phone calls had demonstrated the critical importance of reliable communications in the remote jungle environment. Sarah's story attracted international attention when military officials released details about the terrorist plot. Environmental organizations and scientific journals praised her courage in protecting vital research work in one of the world's most important ecosystems. However, Sarah was more interested in getting back to her regular work than dealing with media attention and award ceremonies. The research team's work took on new significance as they realized how close they had come to losing everything. Their discoveries about rare plant species and ecological relationships were more valuable than ever, especially knowing that criminal organizations had been willing to kill to stop their research. Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose in protecting and studying the Amazon rainforest. Jake surprised everyone by proposing to Sarah during a team celebration of their successful completion of the research project. He had been planning the proposal for months, but her dangerous mission had made him realize how precious their time together really was. The entire team cheered as she accepted, and Dr. Williams immediately began planning how to incorporate a wedding celebration into their research schedule. Months later, Sarah received word that the last members of the rebel network had been captured or had fled the country. The Amazon region was safer for researchers, indigenous communities, and environmental workers thanks to the intelligence she had provided. New research stations were being established, and international funding for conservation work had increased significantly following the publicity about the terrorist threats. Sarah often thought about that terrifying night in the supply depot and how different things might have been if she had chosen a different route or made different decisions. She realized that sometimes the most important moments in life came when you least expected them, and that courage wasn't about not being afraid, but about doing what was right despite the fear. The research team eventually published groundbreaking papers about their plant discoveries, with several species being named in honor of Sarah's contribution to protecting the research. She had set out on a simple supply mission and ended up playing a crucial role in preserving one of the world's most important ecosystems. Her story became an inspiration for other researchers working in dangerous environments around the globe. Years later, Sarah and Jake continued their research work in the Amazon, now with their own small research station and a team of graduate students. The jungle that had once threatened her life had become her home and her life's work. She never forgot the lessons learned during those terrifying days when a routine mission became a battle for survival, and she used that experience to help train other researchers in security awareness and emergency procedures. The Amazon rainforest remained as beautiful and dangerous as ever, but Sarah had proven that with courage, intelligence, and determination, even the most overwhelming threats could be overcome. Her supply mission had saved more than just her research team. It had helped protect an entire ecosystem and the communities that depended on it for their survival and their future.